Well, good afternoon and welcome to Round the Table Live with Christian Concern. And today we are discussing, is the BBC captive to Stonewall? And not the BBC, various other institutions as well. I've got live today with us Dr. Mike Davidson of the Carys Trust. Thank you so much for joining us, Mike. It's great to see you. And also Carys Moseley, who is one of our researchers, policy researchers here at Christian Concern. And the news this week has been a lot about this Nolan Investigates BBC report, kind of ironically into the BBC. I mean, quite a bit about the BBC and the incredible influence that this lobby group Stonewall has. Carys, sum up for us your key takeaways from what Nolan actually finds in this.
It's this highly unusual 10-part podcast series, and so people don't have to have a license to listen to it. It's on BBC Sounds, which I think shows how they want it to be available to everybody, which is interesting in itself. And they're investigating Stonewall's relationship to really public bodies in the UK, including the BBC. And of course, that makes it sort of very unusual. You've got journalists within BBC Northern Ireland, so Nolan and his colleagues investigating and looking at whether this influence has gone too far, because Stonewall is not just a charity, it's also a campaign and lobbying group. And obviously the big picture in the background is that the BBC, like so many other institutions, as well as Ofcom, who regulate the media, have been members of the Stonewall Diversity Champions Programme, which is this workplace equality and diversity programme. And some public bodies have been pulling out of that. Ofcom has pulled out of it. It turns out Ofcom had pulled out of this programme while it was being made. It's taken 18 months to make. And there's been noises in the press about the BBC leaving, although the BBC has never formally said that it has left. So there's still, it's an ongoing story in a way about the actual relationship. And so Nolan's gone around and interviewed a number of people, some of them journalists inside the BBC, one or two LGBT activists outside, the dissidents from the LGBT movement, such as LGBT Alliance and various feminist groups, and asked them for their views and why they have been reevaluating Stonewall. And he also interviews some politicians like the Labour MP Rosie Duffield, who's, her story is well known. It's a very major piece of journalism and very unusual. I think really it's as much about the BBC itself in various ways as it is about those institutions and the issues of transgender and sex.
And if you're watching live on YouTube or Facebook, do post your comments and questions and we can try and respond. I can see there that Preacher Bear, someone called Preacher Bear on YouTube, is saying, why is tolerance only required of those that oppose trans ideology? Well, you're right in a sense. Tolerance should be both ways on this. But Mike, you are based in Northern Ireland and Steve Nolan is a Northern Ireland journalist. What's your perspective on all of this? You've been interviewed by him as well, I understand.
Several times, actually, Tim. The most recent time was following a debate in Stormont, where one of the ministers named and shamed us as being providers of conversion therapy. And amazingly, he gave...
You don't, just to be clear, you don't accept that term, do you?
No, we don't, and we don't use it, and we don't do it. But we were named as providing something that is equivalent to torture. So following that, Nolan interviewed me and actually gave me 35 minutes.
Wow!
Focused entirely on what was going on around all of that.
Wow. And how did you find him as a journalist from your perspective?
Well, I've always found him to be robust. Nolan is Nolan, and that's his brand and that's his style.
Yeah.
So I have also most recently found him to be quite fair. Well, very fair. both in allowing me to talk when I've been in situations where there has been a lot of opposition. He's kind of fought the corner for me to be able to get a word in edgeways. In TV debates, for example, with Jane Ozanne, that was quite a challenge. But as I say, it was unprecedented for him to give me 30 minutes or so, and to focus on these issues as closely as we did.
Okay. And did you find him sympathetic or challenging or neutral?
Well, I think he did his job in that he was able to show some of the inconsistencies that I think there often are when it comes to the factual basis of all of this. I was able to speak about the research. He challenged me on some things. I didn't get to respond by asking him to consider the twin studies and to ask the important question, well, if it's all genetic, then how come identical twins are not 100% concordant when it comes to this issue? So, you know, I think what I respect about Nolan is this capacity for debate and this determination to make sure that people who oppose one another have a context in which to interact. That's quite precious, I would say, within the BBC.
Yeah. No, that's good. And so, Carys, a lot of the talk in this series is about the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme. Tell us about that and the issues around it.
So that's, it's interesting what this series doesn't say. It's the real reason that it's become controversial, this Diversity Champions program, is that Stonewall, since I think 2015, has been supporting trans rights as well. So one of the reasons it became controversial, there was a lawyer called Alison Bailey who helped form this group, the LGBT Alliance, of people who were disgruntled with Stonewall and had been supporters. And she was accusing, one of the things she was saying, that the Stonewall, this Diversity Champion program, employers, big organizations, public bodies, charities, big business sign up to it and pay Stonewall money for equality and diversity training on LGBT issues. But it started in the early 2000s and it was just LGBT issues then. And so it's been around for nearly 20 years. And you can see from the accounts of Stonewall, many government organizations have been paying money for a long time. But it's only being criticized by those who were its supporters and are now worried about it promoting gender self-identification, which of course has been rejected in England and Wales by the public consultation and by the government. And Alison Bailey was one of her criticisms, one of her claims, and she's going to court about this, is that Stonewall was effectively involved in watching her, getting her, working, conniving with her former employers in the workplace to watch her and spy on her. I don't know if these are the exact words, but that's definitely what's being conveyed. And so that's kind of an overreach. And it's quite extraordinary. I can't think of an equivalent with other issues, actually. But also Stonewall was criticized. There's been lots of freedom of information requests before the Nolan program got broadcast. So that they were effectively, through organizations, including government departments being members, were being made to support the reform of the Gender Recognition Act to make gender self-identification law. And that was clearly a step too far. It's a matter of legitimate public debate, just like any other proposed policy. And it's not fair to get the average employee signed up without them really knowing what's going on. So there's been gradual awareness, and the BBC has now been catching up with this criticism. And I think it's clearly what's happened. It's coming from employees within the BBC who are unhappy.
I thought it was very interesting that they submitted lots of FOIs to lots of different government and other organisations, and they mostly responded, but the BBC didn't respond to any of them.
The BBC didn't respond. Neither did Whitehall. They say Westminster, they mean Whitehall departments. And I think they did, unfortunately, Nolan didn't say which departments they'd written to, because that would be very illuminating. I'd like to know, for example, whether they wrote to the Ministry of Justice, which is responsible for prisons and having male sex offenders in women's prisons, which practically nobody sensible agrees with, and people like the LGBT Alliance wouldn't agree with.
And lots of organisations have left the Stonewall Championship scheme, Diversity's Championship scheme, including, I think, the Ministry of Justice and Ofcom and Channel 4 and various other very big corporations. But to sort of go to the question that we're highlighting today, right, Mike, the BBC, is it captive to Stonewall? What's your perspective?
Well, I think it is certainly captive to an ideology that can only be described as Marxist, cultural Marxist, in the sense that it has taken on board one point of view. It's a kind of siloed view that is very difficult to challenge. And I think this is it. We don't have ideological diversity in the BBC. We have this kind of monoculture that isn't allowed to be challenged. I know there's been a kind of tokenism, and I've often felt like the Ofcom slot, if I can put it that way, when I've been in these debates, often with 3 or 4 people who hold a totally contrary view to the one that I would hold, and then there would be me. And very often there is very little chance to be able to have these debates. And so that's why I feel that it is certainly captive to this single-minded ideology that is depriving us of the life and support that should be, fundamental to a national broadcaster.
I wanted to see. Go on, Mike. Yeah, go on.
Sorry, I wanted to just reflect on when we were doing the bus case. In 2013 and 14, I remember the one and only time I debated anybody from Stonewall. It was Andy Moseley, who was working for Stonewall at the time. But that was the last ever opportunity I had. I did have occasion on BBC programs to come on, and the expectancy would be that there would be somebody from Stonewall, but they didn't show up. And so I would be alone with the presenters. And this seemed to be what came into being after that particular interview on World News. I think it was BBC World News. They just refused to give us airspace, and have, similarly to the way the Ozanne Foundation has treated us, they don't want to give us any airtime. Now, there have been programs that have given us space, but not ever with Stonewall being involved, which I think is interesting.
I can see John Winlow watching us on Facebook has put a comment here. People, including me, he says, have been complaining for years about BBC bias, but it still goes on and became an organ of propaganda against Christian values, the family and sociability, yet it's a public service, supposedly without bias. How come the public have been unable to change it? Carys, what's your view on this?
I think part of the clue is that the organisations, I'm not sure exactly what the BBC are, to look at Stonewall's accounts, have been members of Stonewall for much longer than most people want to admit. It's not just the trans issue, it goes deeper. And gentleman is right that it's a long-term problem. I think the de-Christianization of society has been long-term and gradual in Britain, and it's not true of everywhere else in the Western world. I mean, we have more freedom of information and such like than we did maybe 25 years ago. So perhaps things are only coming to light now that the public can challenge. I think that nowadays there's much of a fuss about free speech across the board, whatever your political religious views. So more people are waking up to the consequences. That's all I can really say. I mean, the other thing, of course, has been the rise of the internet and the proliferation of new media, new news media and social media has enabled more of us to be involved in discussion and research for ourselves. We no longer have, BBC television news as the main kind of news. It's old people who think like that. But people of working age and young people don't think like that anymore.
Yeah.
I think something that is of concern is that these current podcasts kind of are based on looking at the LGBT alliance. They don't go deeper than that. They don't go to the fundamentals of, this ideology that has accepted uncritically the notion of orientation or words such as homophobia. We haven't done, we're still not getting to the root of all of this.
Yes.
And so it's quite safe at the moment because it's just within the context of what has happened with the development.
It strikes me, Mike, because, you mentioned this conversion therapy earlier, and we know that the government is planning to bring out a consultation on whether or how, more likely how, to ban conversion therapy. And the BBC ran a news article a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, saying, the consultation's been delayed, and people are very upset about the consultation being delayed. And it was so one-sided that every person quoting the article was very disappointed, really upset that the consultation's been delayed. It's so bad. And it's like the BBC's become a propaganda organization for a ban of conversion therapy. There was no attempt at neutrality in this article, for example.
And why stop at the BBC? I think it's traditional media, because if you look at how the Ozanne Foundation's Faith and Sexuality survey was just taken on board by all of mainstream media, there was no critique, no analysis of that document, which has turned out to be an appalling document from a methodological point of view. So, this is something that is inherent in what some have called the legacy media. This traditional, old media approach, I would argue, has definitely been overtaken in this country. It's not the same when you go to Eastern Europe. That's what fascinates me. Eastern Europeans suss out very quickly this kind of one-sided ideology, but it doesn't seem to be something that we here in the West are particularly able to discern as quickly as they can.
Well, I wonder if GB News might be something of a counterbalance on this kind of thing.
I think, can I just jump in there? So when you're thinking about the bigger picture, the Diversity Champions program, there's no documentation that is explicitly linked to pushing for ban for conversion therapy, unlike the documentation that proves that institutions were pushing for gender self-ID, like, for example, the Scottish government. But It's hard not to see connections. So in the Nolan series, they actually they talk about the post, which now seems to have been quietly abolished, of the BBC News LGBT correspondent. And the person who used to fill that role was clearly close to Stonewall, and it was obvious from their Twitter feeds. They were filmed, fronting Stonewall videos and things, and that came in for heavy criticism from gender critical feminists and others, and quite deservedly so, because there are rules with the BBC editorial guide, I think, about what journalists are allowed to say and convey. They can't just convey a partisan view on their social media, and we know there's been this big overhaul under the new leadership of the BBC, concerned for all sorts of different reasons about the appearance of impartiality. But it's not good enough just to have the appearance of impartiality. When there was a role of the new BBC News LGBT correspondent, Mike was never interviewed, and others, perhaps with a similar view, were never interviewed on the news. Now, I managed to get hold of the job description of the news correspondent through Freedom of Information, because you can do that. There are things you can't ask the BBC. For example, the editorial decisions, and that's fair enough. You have to have confidentiality as journalists. But and of course, so there was quite a normal job description, quite acceptable, but it added something about the importance of storytelling and reaching younger audiences. And how that affected the content on, for example, conversion therapy, was that there was a lot of storytelling about victims or survivors, allegedly, which you couldn't really verify. But there was never any interviewing by this news correspondent of people who said they benefited from what is pejoratively called conversion therapy. That's obvious bias, and is obviously a breach of impartiality.
Yes. And I think there were some other extraordinary revelations from Nolan, like their uncritically adopted Stonewall policy, actually outdated policy, that you need to have cisgender allies, so to speak, of LGBT. People would wear a badge saying, I'm willing to speak up on behalf of LGBT. Very offensive, actually, to LGBT people, that they can't speak for themselves. And this gender-bred man that was promoting very young, that staff training for a BBC presents a one-sided view on trans ideology, and they all have to do this as if this is the view of the BBC, which is it's not a neutral view. It's totally a campaign view about transgenderism, isn't it? But it is encouraging to see this kind of expose, really, of Stonewall's influence, isn't it, of the BBC? Coming on the back of various organisations leaving the Stonewall Diversity Championship scheme. I mean, do you think that this is going to help and going to the BBC might drop it? Mike, what's your thoughts?
I think a move towards honesty and embracing diversity in the true sense is bound to help, because it creates the space for debate and for contest and for ideas and for scientific analysis. And anything that promotes that, I think, is going in the right direction. The question is how brave this new wave will be and how deep it will plow the field, because at the moment it's good, it's encouraging, but it's quite superficial. We need to go much deeper into what has happened. For example, when we exposed that the Royal College of Psychiatrists basically had misled both the church and the state, because when they submitted their documentation when equal marriage was coming up, it was easy to demonstrate that the references that they cited were not accurate in terms of what the primary sources were saying about things like the mental health state of LGBT persons. And yet that was never taken up. This is not just our opinion against theirs. At the time, there was a Church of England report that agreed with us and said that we had correctly discerned the fact that these primary sources had been misquoted, but nothing was ever done about it. And this is the issue. It's much, much deeper than just those who are doing media work. It's in the institutions. It's in the mental health bodies primarily. All of them have been tied up by the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, which is, again, the product of ideologues getting together. We were refused access to the round table that took place in 2013 and 14, and freedom of information requests that have been asked for in that area has very clearly revealed that it was, for example, the UKCP and various other stakeholders who deliberately kept us out of discussion. And this is the problem. It's one point of view that is being imposed, and it's demonstrated in that kind of context.
What I thought was refreshing, though, in this podcast, episode 5 in particular, I thought was very good, called a Gender Clinic Insider Speaks Out, where they have Dr. David Bell, who is a whistleblower at from Tavistock, a consultant psychiatrist at Tavistock, and I don't think there's any evidence a child is ever born in the wrong body. He says you can't change your gender. It's a fact. He says clinicians, Nolan says, surely professional clinicians will be neutral. Sure, they won't be frightened of asking the right questions. And Bell says, well, I'm afraid they are, because of exactly this kind of lobbying and Stonewall. He says, I don't think it's ever helpful to call a child a trans child. And, all these things which are supportive of the case of Nigel and Sally Rowe, which we were highlighting just last week, I think, we were trying to challenge the government about trans policies in schools. Carys, what's your thoughts on that?
I think generally so yes, the interview with David Bell focused quite specifically on the clinic, but of course I think it was David Bell who said it's a much wider problem. And so, for example, I don't think it was mentioned that the Care Quality Commission, which is in England, is or has been a member of Stonewall, and that was remarked when there has been controversy about inspecting the Gender Identity Development Service, the Tavistock. How independent and how free were the people inside the Care Quality Commission to really say what needed to be said? And that's true for just about every institution. So in a way, what's interesting, because of the BBC's influence across the media, and the way people can feel intimidated by it, for some reason I've never quite understood, it's bound to have an influence on all sorts of other institutions like schools. So, for example, the BBC deals a lot with education. It has, especially during the lockdown, it had online material for children who are required to stay at home. And that's, teachers might be choosing to use that. I don't know if it would be up to the individual school to make it compulsory, but it has a responsibility. I mean, it has been promoting transgenderism. It has been promoting the idea of 100 different genders and so on. So this is not simply about the media talking about itself, although regrettably I think there's an element of that in this series. It does have implications for schools and just all kinds of institutions.
And may I say also for banks. So here's Barclays Bank, a great multinational bank. My grandfather was a bank manager of Barclays many years ago. I think my family has only ever banked with Barclays, but they closed down our banking in Core Issues Trust and the International Federation for Therapeutic and Counseling Choice because of a very concerted campaign on social media against us, where activists decided to question Barclays about the legitimacy of us having business accounts in Barclays. And they closed down our accounts. And of course, surely it's a clear link. Barclays is funding Pride in London. So, it's
intolerant,
deeply embedded in our society, in our parliament. To me, it's felt like Stonewall is just, another department in the government, I would say. So rampant has been the intention of taking on board what they teach and preach. So I think it's hugely encouraging that this critique has begun. It's safe, and I think it augurs well for the future if it continues.
Yeah, but do you think that the critique is being led by the LGB, excluding the T, of people, and is that an issue in terms of ways?
They may be contributing, and I know there's a special agenda there, but I'm hoping that this is the wheels beginning to come off the axles, because this business is unsustainable. This is a bit like what happened in the Soviet Union. Eventually, it just disintegrated because it couldn't work. And this gender ideology, I'm afraid, is just not sustainable in society. It's going to do a lot of damage. We're going to feel it probably for a long time. But I don't believe it can continue in the direction that it has been going in.
Well, it's too far
I
from
think that there is, who is being interviewed and who's not being interviewed is important. So you had the CEO of Pink News, who was, people commented on that, as if he's kind of close to Stonewall's view, but perhaps not officially representing them, and that's relevant and important. And of course, you could, if you have access to social media, which most people do now, you could look at that. You had somebody who said they were non-binary for a whole program and things like that, but you didn't have social conservatives or moderate. It was all, feminist or LGBT or LGB commentators. And so from the point of view, the majority of the population, actually, who's heterosexual, this looks like a sect divided against itself. That's one way of seeing it, right? And obviously there's lots of complications. We've discussed some of the ramifications. But I'm not happy, I'm not satisfied with this. To have people, LGBT activists defending biology, I'm sorry, their lives go against human biology. I mean, they're entitled to defend single-sex spaces, and I'm glad that they are, and many of them have always done that when you look carefully at the history. But you had one activist who was interviewed a lot talking about, well, the word mother, and you need to preserve that. And it wasn't gay people who wanted to get rid of the word mother. And he does speak for a section of that population, rightly so. And we know that from lots of other media and the debates about marriage. Yeah. But who was it who brought in same-sex parenting? Because same-sex parenting gets rid of either your mother or your father. If you were a child being brought up by two dads, you don't have a mother. So it's not just about the word, it's about not actually having a relationship with either a biological mother or an adoptive one. Yes. And I think that needs to be said clearly. Not one single journalist who's talked about this podcast series has talked about that.
Yeah. Listen, I can see some more comments coming up on Facebook and YouTube. If you've got more questions, do add them in there. I just want to bring this one up. Lauren Davidson on Facebook says it's not just the mental health field. Dr. Peter McCulloch and others have clearly indicated the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, as well, have been captured. Science has been politicized. The problem is there's a taboo surrounding anything around who has captured the institutions. Transgender is a small part of the deeper ideology, and the banks of the institutions are at the center of this. Mike, I saw you nodding there. Do you want to comment on that?
I'm just agreeing. I think that's right. We're in deep trouble in our society because we're having difficulty discerning, I think, the way out of this and a return to criticality. I came from a South African background, and I'd spent years in higher education in South Africa and going through all the rise against apartheid and all the difficulties that people were having in those days. And I remember coming into the UK and feeling this is everybody was just kind of getting on with their careers. There was very little challenge and very little, rough and tumble in terms of political debate within the universities. I hope that's not unfair, but that was just my impression coming in 1999. And I think this is the great shame. And it's reinforced when I've tried to get into universities, even though I worked in the system in this country for, more than 15 years. I found it very difficult to get into scripture unions, etc.
Well, just let me put up this comment here from John Sharp, because it relates to what you're saying there, Mike. A huge issue is that our churches refuse to discuss this whole area. The Bible is very frank on many issues. It's possible to preach on these things graciously. The groundwork of teaching sound doctrine has to happen first, but we have too much therapeutic theology, so to speak. Mike?
Well, I think the words of Jesus were therapeutic, and Jesus was a wonderful counselor. And I think counseling and therapy that is Christian-based can be very useful. I feel we must be very careful of kind of dichotomizing this.
Yeah.
And I would be opposed to the psychologization of the gospel. I don't believe that we should go anywhere near that. But I don't think we should be afraid of science that looks at psychology and psychotherapy from a fact-based point of view. I would oppose anything to do with New Age or anything that would be, poor therapeutic and counseling approaches. But I think we must be very careful of pushing away the mental health field and just getting on with the gospel, so to speak, because that is what is causing a major problem here. The church needs to stand up and resist any kind of bad practice in mental health or anywhere else, but not simply isolate itself and get on with what it thinks is its task, because the gospel's approach to all of this, I think, is very clear. We need to stand for truth, and wherever truth is, we go with it, and wherever there is falsehood, we oppose it and we expose it for what it is.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, Carys, one of the things about this is that was highlighted in the podcast is there's so different identities now, and of course none of them have legal basis. That you can still only have male and female in British law, but there's all these other identities, and Stonewall is pushing for recognition of them, and even pushing employers to ask their staff, "What are you? Are you not just male or female? I don't know, genderqueer or two-spirit or whatever." And the funniest moment in the podcast was when Stephen Nolan asked Ben Cohen of Pink News, the editor of Pink News, what is two-spirit? And Ben Cohen can't answer him. And he says, what is genderqueer? And Ben Cohen doesn't know. And it's like, well, Ben Cohen, look, you're the editor of Pink News. You don't know. How are the rest of us supposed to know? Do you think this is collapsing, this idea of multiple genders, Carys?
I think it won't last because because it's based on totally rejecting what people who want sort of non-binary identities want in law, they want rights, is to refuse to record your biological sex completely. And I mean, that's not sustainable. It's antisocial, really. It's one thing for you to go around saying, psychologically, I feel like I'm neither male or female. That's not really that much of a problem because many people perhaps don't fit a complete stereotype. But when you're saying, as a social embodied being, we're all either male or female biologically, and that affects our behavior, really. And it affects the extremes of behavior as well. So men are more prone to extremes, than women. I think that's the overall evidence. Then government has a role and a duty to not organize, but to protect the population from antisocial behavior, and we know the consequences of that. So that's what wash. People of all sorts of persuasions don't really like it. I don't think, and I think I sometimes wonder why they've pushed this far. Not just Stonewall, but many other groups. And is it because by asking for something completely outlandish, they know that most institutions will say no, but will grant them something else, which actually is just as controversial? That is a well-known campaign tactic.
Well, maybe. I think they actually believe this stuff. I mean, I think they actually do. I'm just reading Dawn Bradford on Facebook. Unfortunately, feelings trumping facts is an insidious method to stop frank and full discussion of this subject. Cancel culture prevents this also. I think you're absolutely right there, Dawn. So let's wrap up now, Mike. Where do we think this is going? We've exposed now, or that Nolan has exposed, we've been saying it for a long time, that these institutions are captured by this crazy ideology, the trans ideology and Stonewall, all that sort of stuff. So what happens next, and what should we be doing as Christians about this now?
Well, I think we should build on the foundation that has, or the crack in the door. The door's slightly ajar and the light is coming in. We need to help it, and we need to be active in our own spheres, talking about the truth and standing for what is right, being fair-minded in terms of how we work with other people. But I think, it's looking good at the moment, but we'll have to wait and see what the government says about its consultation on conversion therapy, because that is going to be, I guess, an indicator of just how balanced we're going to be in the future and how far the government has learnt with respect to some of these issues that are not, keeping the wheels on as everybody thought things were going in the right direction.
That's a good point, Carys.
I think we should be careful. I try not to be an optimist. I think this is very complex, and we don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes. Of course, the LGBT Alliance has just had this conference, and it seems to be welcomed with open arms by the Conservative government that wants to ban what it calls conversion therapy. And there's also this tendency to pretend that all so-called trans kids or teenagers being sent to gender clinics are really lesbians or gays. There's no evidence for that in the UK. And when the Kirabel judgment in the High Court, the judges kept on complaining that the Tavistock wasn't giving them data because they don't actually collect it properly. So there's no possibility. And I want to see an end to the LGBT Alliance saying, and its supporters saying things that they can't actually prove like that, because this is the total normalization of homosexuality. And it's a continuation of this attitude against the body and against nature, actually. But the other thing I think that's important to say is everybody in Fleet Street is dancing around and saying, isn't it wonderful? There's criticism of Stonewall and all this. Stonewall, to be fair to it, is being used as a scapegoat here when most institutions, most major institutions across government, across public sector, even private sector, have willingly signed up to it, willingly signed up and paid it, our taxes, our money, our charitable donations. This is a Romans 1 situation. All of society is complicit, even when we don't want to be. And I think that is, Lord have mercy. That's what we actually need to say as Christians. We don't need to play along with this new media narrative. And we should actually be analysing it very carefully from a biblical and Christian standpoint. Where have we not spoken up when we could have? What can we do now? How can we build insight and understanding graciously and truthfully among Christians? That's where I want to take things.
Great stuff, Carys. Great stuff. Any closing word from you, Mike?
No, but thank you very much for having me. And well done, Carys, in all that you are doing and Christian Concern. We really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Well, and we've got our eyes watching very much for this consultation when it comes out some point, probably in the next few weeks, and we'll be very much alerting your supporters and viewers about that as well. Listen, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Carys. Great to have you with us. And thank you for watching. If you're watching live or not, we look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, same place. And yes, thank you. Do follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Goodbye.